All right, if you want to open up your Bible to Genesis chapter 4, this is one of those lessons where I would really have loved to keep going this morning because I think these lessons go together this morning and tonight. And instead of pushing this off to next Sunday, I really want to do it while it's fresh. And especially some of the language is just so similar and I think parallel. And so I would like for you to see some of that. In case you weren't here this morning, we talked about Genesis chapter 4 and verse 16 through 24, and we talked about the way of Cain. This is the direction as Cain left the presence of God because of sin. This is the direction that Cain went. The text tells us that he built a city and he named the city after his son. And so I kind of treated that as this is Cain doing his own thing. He's building his own world out there away from the presence of God. And somebody said, I got so many comments today after this morning's sermon, and I thought, man, I wish you had made that comment to me before, because I went home and I wrote them in my notes. I don't remember who made which comments, but somebody said for the first thing, it's not just a picture of falling farther and farther away from the presence of God. There is a lot of the why there's falling farther and farther from the presence of God. And I think that one was a really good one to think about. We talked about the destruction of the family, the fall of the family and the destruction of the home. That's one of the things that you see happening in this text. And then we talked about the culture or the society thing. Lamech's three sons building flocks. He was the father of all of those who had their flocks, and there's instruments, and then there's bronze and iron. And so some of our conversation after church, I think I had a couple of these. You think about the flocks as like economy. You think about the lyre and the harp as culture or art. And you can think about the bronze and the iron as technology. And so basically it's the building up of what I would call, what the Bible calls, the world. It's everything that gives us meaning and purpose and fulfillment in life that is not God. Building our own city over here. And then we talked about violence, the increasing violence, the decreasing value of human life. And I think that's really a picture of arrogance. Anyway, that's what we did this morning. And that's one way. That's the way of Cain. Today, I think what we're going to do, or tonight, starting in verse 25, is we're going to look at the other direction. And it starts off really short. Look at the text here in verse 25. Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enoch. At that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. And then all of chapter 5, I know it's hard to believe, but we'll just cover all of one full chapter in one fell swoop tonight. But there's a lot of genealogies there that I'm not going to read, and I'll point you to some of the stuff there. But let me show you this. I thought this was really interesting, and I'd like for you to see it. You have the two genealogies here side by side in a chart. On the left, you have the genealogy that we looked at this morning, the way of Cain. And on the right, you have Adam had Seth, and the genealogy all the way through chapter 5 that proceeds. And so just looking at the chart, I mean, the very first thing that you have to notice, I think that you just have to see, is the very biblical numbers. On one side, you have 7 people in the genealogy. On another side, you have 10 people in the genealogy. And it's like, okay, so I would think there's definitely going to be a point whenever you see something like that. Like, that's not accidental whenever you see it in the Bible. And another thing that you would notice, I think, there are a couple of people with the same names. You've got 2 Enochs. You've got 2 Lamechs. And then near the end here, Lamech is the end of this genealogy. He has 3 sons. Noah is the end of this genealogy, and he has 3 sons. And the thing is you look at these, and it's like, okay, they go together. We're supposed to say, these things go together. This one is this one is this. And this morning we talked about the way of Cain. Today we want to talk about the other direction. I do think that it is at least worth considering here. Look at this. When Lamech, well, let's do Lamech first before we talk about his sons. But when you see Lamech, who had 3 sons this morning, those 3 sons were building the world. This Lamech had a son named Noah, whose name means relief or rest. And we'll talk about that tonight, where God says, I'm going to give rest to the world. I'm going to have this curse that you're living under. I'm going to have some sense of relief or some sense of rest, or coming back to me and coming back to my ways. And so there's a good contrast with the 2 Lamechs. I think also if you compare what was happening at the time that these 3 sons of Lamech were building up the world, what was happening at the same time on Seth's side? There's Enoch, and Enoch stands out in the genealogy of Genesis chapter 5. Everybody else died, he died, but Enoch didn't. He walked with God. And so look at these genealogies as, normally you look at a genealogy and like, what a boring list of names. I'm reading through the Bible, trying to do my Bible reading, and you come to a genealogy and it's like I'm reading every line in the genealogy. It's like, skip that and go here. These are really actually meant to instruct us and to teach us about something. And so let's jump into some of the lessons here, I think. Number 1, verse 25. Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, for she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. This is something that I would think you ought to know by now. Like so often in the Bible, I'm going to name my child so-and-so because something. And the name either means the something that God said, or it sounds like the something that God said, and that's what's going on here. They name their son, their 3rd son, after Abel and Cain. They name him Seth, and Seth, I don't remember if it sounds like appointed or if it means appointed. I could find out here for you real quick. I wrote it down in my notes. The name Seth means something like placed, God placed, or God appointed, or God set, or God granted. That's the general idea of what's going on here. And look at chapter 4 and verse 1. I don't know if this is something that we're supposed to do with this one, but in chapter 4 and verse 1, Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. Their first son is the attitude, I have gotten. And then they run through the whole Cain and Abel story. And I wonder if what's going on here is Eve, probably Adam and Eve together, are finding some humility and learning from some hard lessons in life that they've just learned with their own sin and with their family, Cain and Abel. It's not, I have gotten. It's just another example of God being merciful and merciful and merciful again, and saying, this is God's doing. This is God's will. I would like to see the naming of their son. God has appointed. God has granted this thing. Because, Abel got murdered and Cain didn't work out. And so here is God being even more merciful to them in a bad situation. I'd like to think that that's one of the things. And I do think that you see the contrast here. Back in chapter 4 and verse 17, what we read this morning, The attitude of God has appointed, God has given me this child, that is very different from what we saw with the way of Cain in verse 17. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch, and when he built a city, he called the name of the city after his son. The attitude this time is, God has given me this child. And so that's at least something to think about with that. I would like to think, whether I'm reading it into the story or not, I would like to think that there is at least some maturity and humility going on here. I do think we can say for 100% on this one, though, and I would even say, write this one in your Bible so you don't forget it. In verse 25, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. Don't forget Genesis 3:15, which I have tried to say over and over again, and don't take my words as anything special, but I look at Genesis 3:15 as at least one of the most important verses in all the Bible, where God was putting a curse on the snake, and he said, I will put enmity between you, the snake, and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. That verse is the first gospel. It's the first picture of Jesus and the offspring of woman who's going to come and stomp on the head of the snake. And we said it just a second ago. Abel got murdered. Cain didn't work out because he was a killer. And yet here is God appointing another offspring. And I'm not going to go down this path, but boy, there's a whole sermon in that all by itself. You see it with Israel again and again and again. Israel has God's promise, and they have God's plan. They're supposed to be doing God's plan throughout the world, but they don't, and they're sinful, and they fail, and they fall apart, and they step off the path, but that does not hinder God's plan. God still works his plan. Just because Abel got killed and Cain turned into a murderer doesn't mean that God's plan is over. That's what you see happening with the story of Seth. God has appointed for me another offspring. Okay, look at this next one. They call his name, Seth has a son, and they call his name Enoch. Now, I'm going to throw some words, some definitions up on the board for you here. And I'm going to tell you in a second why I'm putting the definitions up here for you. But Enoch is a word like Adam that means man. Adam, don't you wish that you would have been called Enoch instead of Adam? You mean basically the same thing. Let's call him Enoch from now on. Except for this. Except for this. Enoch that means man or humanity. Look at these two definitions. Though the etymology of Hebrew is uncertain, its usage often refers to the frailty and the insignificance of man. So it is man, but it's like man's not doing so hot, like the weakness of man. The second one, often it suggests man's weakness, his mortality, and distance from God. And the reason why I put those up there is because I'm going to use these words to make the point. Frailty, insignificance, weakness, mortality. The way of Cain, Cain's lineage is building up cities, technology, culture, all the things, things that we talked about today. The way of Seth, so one way you have, look at me, look how powerful I am, look how great the world is that we can create, we're super awesome. But the way of Seth is Enoch, frail, insignificant, weak, and mortal man. And I had a point to say about that, except for this. That's basically what Mike said in his prayer this morning at the end of services. And I thought, well, Mike was praying. I was like, well, there's my point. God, you see the world around us. You see all of us thinking that we have all of these great accomplishments. But we're not. We're not all of that great stuff. We're Enoch instead. And so you've got the way of thinking that you're awesome, or you've got the way of smallness and humility, which is what you see over and over again with Jesus, who says, the great are the least, and the least shall be great, over and over again. And so there is something I think that you should see there. and compare to that. But this is the big one. I mean, of all the things, this is the big daddy of them all. In verse 26, to Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enoch. And here is the alternate path from what we talked about this morning. With Cain, humanity went this way. With Seth, at that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Look at Genesis chapter 11 with me, please. I think that you see this exact same point about the two ways in the comparison between the people trying to build the Tower of Babel and the promise that God made to Abraham. Look at chapter 11 and verse 1. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as the people migrated eastward, there's that thing again, moving away from the presence of God. As they moved eastward, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said, here's the way of Cain. They said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top to the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. It's the way of Cain, where it's all about humanity making their own stuff and doing their own thing. And then you get to Abraham in chapter 12 and verse 1, and you see the alternative. It's not what man is doing, but what God is doing. Chapter 12 and verse 1. The Lord said to Abram, go from your country and from your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed, not cursed. If you want to mark that in your Bible, chapter 11, that's red. Let us build for ourselves. That's red. In chapter 12, that's green. I will do this. I will do this. I will do this. So here are the two ways. And look at the way of Abraham. That's God's way. Chapter 12 and verse 8. This is the point. This is why I'm here. From there, Abraham moved to the hill country on the east side of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. The way of God and the way of God's people is not, look at me and all my stuff and doing my things. The way of God and the way of God's people is calling on the name of the Lord and God working through us and God doing his stuff and us living according to his ways. In chapter 4, it's not just that they began to call upon the name of the Lord. In just a minute, when we get to Enoch, we're going to talk about walking with God. And so here is the way of God. Here's one thing that I found that I thought was worth sharing with you about people calling on the name of the Lord. Some people, albeit a remnant, the way of Seth is a smaller way than the rest of the world. The way of Seth, albeit a remnant, thus were not caught up in the good life, but were more concerned about spiritual things. I was reading this tonight, getting ready for this lesson, and I heard Mike's prayer again. That's basically what he said in his prayer. Not caught up in a good life, but were more concerned about spiritual things. Israel could trace their heritage to Enoch in spiritual matters as well. The people of God have always been able to use the advances of culture for their task, but they have had to learn to keep things in proper perspective. That's the key from this morning. That's what we're talking about. The evidence of this perspective and the safeguarding of it lies in the message of the narrative. In an affluent and self-indulgent society, the righteous must preserve the knowledge of the Lord. And so here's the thing. Yes, technology is cool. We've got technology. But it's not used for creating fights and division and sharing what I'm eating for dinner on Facebook. It's used to call upon the name of the Lord. This author says, preserving the name and the knowledge of the Lord, and to share it. There's the way of Cain and the way of the world, and there's the way of Seth, the alternative. And so there are those verses. Let's jump through chapter 5 just real quick. 3 things that I think you can see in chapter 5. Number 1, I won't read these names and this genealogy. If you don't have this, I would really recommend it. I don't care. If you're someone who's like, I don't write in my Bible, cool. I don't do it. But this is really useful to see the point in chapter 5. Remember, red means bad. And so in verse 5, thus all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. In verse 8, all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. In verse 11, and he died. In verse 14, and he died. In verse 17, and he died. In verse 20, and he died. In verse 27, and he died. In verse 31, and he died. If you're going to move away from the presence of God and the world is going to go the way that the world is going to go with Cain, then the world is going to be dominated by death. Remember, that's what God said to Adam. In the day that you eat from it, you will surely die. And we're just moving farther and farther away from the presence of God. Keep your finger here and look at Romans chapter 5. I was thinking about this from our Romans study that we did last quarter. In Romans chapter 5, I think right around verses 12 through 14. Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. And this is where I'm getting. For sin indeed was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not counted where there is no law, yet death reigned. That's what's happening in Genesis chapter 5. You see, death reigns. It's everywhere. It's in control. That's the world that we live in. It's our greatest foe. And the most horrible thing about life on this earth is the eventual outcome of us all and the suffering that it produces. And so here you go. Genesis chapter 5. We live in a world where death reigns. Yet, look at chapter 5 and verse 21. And he died, and he died, and he died, and he died, and he died. Verse 21. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after he fathered Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. That's the 2 ways. Do you see the comparison? With the way of Cain and everything we talked about this morning leads to death, ultimately. And he died. But there is another way of those who call on the name of the Lord. Or in this situation with Enoch, those who walk with God. He didn't live like everybody else, so he didn't die like everybody else. He walked with God instead. That was his manner of being, his nature. And I think that this points us back. I got to remember the verse. Genesis chapter 3 and verse 8. It points us back to what we saw in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve had already sinned, but in verse 8 it says, they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. To walk with God means to be in the presence of God. And so this is the way. This is the alternative to the stuff that we talked about this morning. And then finally, all hope is not lost. I think that this is what we saw back in chapter 4 and verse 26, that God has appointed for me another offspring, that God's promise still stands. Look at chapter 5 and verse 28. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son. And he called his name Noah, saying, this is where we're going to do the thing where you see a name and then there's a sentence after the name. And something in that sentence has to do with the name. He called his name Noah, saying, out of the ground that the Lord is cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. I've got a note in my Bible next to the word relief that says Noah sounds like the Hebrew word for relief or for rest. Let me see if I can go back here real quick. I want to show you something that I did not realize about this. Let's see. This chart. It's like a reset. You can make your chart if you want. Check me on everything, especially when it comes to numbers. But you chart out all the years. Adam lived this long. This is how long these people lived. Read through the genealogy in Genesis chapter 5. And if my math is correct, Noah was the first person to be born after the death of Adam. So Adam lived into the life of Lamech, and he died, and then Noah was born. And I wonder if you can see any meaning in that for what we're talking about right now. Especially since Adam is the person who sinned and brought the curse on the world. And then Adam dies, and the next person in the list born after Adam is Noah. And God says, here comes Noah. He's going to, because of the curse on the ground, out of the curse of the ground, he's going to bring relief or rest. And it's almost like God is saying, here is your opportunity to reset. You mess this up. All this stuff is messed up because of sin. And you've moved away from the presence of God. And all this stuff, even though we're coming through the lineage of Seth, he died. It's all ruled by death. But Adam dies, and the world that Adam created with his sin, he dies. And now the next person born is Noah, and God says, I'm going to bring relief. It's almost like God is saying in this story, here comes the reset, where you're going to have another chance. Kevin, I see your thing. Would you go there for me? Go back to Matthew chapter 11. Matthew chapter 11. We read this morning. It was intentionally supposed to be for this lesson, but I thought when we were going, this is a great, it's called the Great Invitation. I mean, it's the great invitation for all lessons, but this is the invitation for us as we talk about these two ways, the way of Cain, the way of the world that only ends in death. There's no hope in that way. Or there is the way of God, where we call on the name of the Lord and we walk with God. And we don't live like everybody else, so we don't die like everybody else. I think about Jesus and the great invitation in Matthew 11 and verse 28. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden. That's the story of Genesis chapter 5 in the world that is just completely dominated by death. And you feel it, like we feel it. I'm not pointing at anybody, that would be cruel, but our congregation especially feels it right now. And it's overwhelming, like it just weighs you down. And Jesus calls to those people, weighed down by the burden of the world and the way of Cain. And he says, those of you who are heavy laden, come to me. This is the alternative. This is the way of God. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. The great reset doesn't come from Noah, it comes from Jesus. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Take my yoke upon you. And he talks about there's a burden that goes with it, but it's a light burden. It's not the way of the world. It's not the way of everything is super awesome and fun and great all the time. That's the way of Cain. But the invitation that Jesus offers is for us to come to him, and that is the place where we're going to find relief and rest for our souls. And so if you're here tonight and you're ready to do that, we would love to help you out with it. Come forward now. Make your needs known as we stand and sing the invitation song.